we need to remember that, like Jesus, it's okay to struggle. Okay to struggle with our fasting, with searching and finding out what our call is, and following that call to ultimately fulfilling the purpose that God has given us on earth. In the Lenten season so far, we've seen a few versions of Jesus. We've seen a Jesus that wrestles with the devil and wild beasts in the desert. We see a Jesus that is divine as he sits on top of a mountain and talks with Elijah and Moses. And we see a Jesus that is wrathful as he faces those that seem to desecrate his father's house and the temple. But this week we see a more human version of Jesus. We see a Jesus that struggles. In today's gospel reading, Jesus talks about the call to follow him, to sacrifice our lives for him, and ultimately to glorify the name of God. But when it comes to his purpose, Jesus hesitates for the first time in this Lenten season. And he admits to us that he's struggling by saying, I'm in trouble. But then he says, but what am I to do? Because he knows that the purpose that he is given on earth by God through his life and eventual death does not lead to nothing, does not lead to a permanent death, but it leads to the salvation of all of us on earth and to the ultimate glorifying of God's name. He says this in a most poetic way at the beginning of the Gospel, as he says, unless a grain of wheat falls onto the ground and dies, it remains just a grain of wheat. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. As we get deeper into the Lenten season and toward its end, but also past the Lenten season, we need to remember that, like Jesus, it's okay to struggle. Okay to struggle with our fasting, with searching and finding out what our call is, and following that call to ultimately fulfilling the purpose that God has given us on earth. Because through the struggle, it doesn't lead to nothing. It doesn't lead to a death, but leads to the bearing of much fruit. Not just for ourselves, probably least of all for ourselves, but for our family, our friends, our work colleagues, and ultimately for the glory of God. Stay blessed.